The topic of today's video is neither directly nor indirectly related to veganism. But I noticed the first comment in my comment section is about veganism. Not that surprising if you know a little bit about me or about my channel. And I'm probably going to mention veganism a few times as a useful sort of parallel or as a useful sort of contrasting example. But two parallel lines, by definition, will never intersect. These two things we're discussing, although comparable, are very much discrete. It's one thing as a vegan to deal with people who just never thought about any of the ethical issues involved in veganism. It's never occurred to them. And, sometimes people pretend, sometimes people, have an artifice about them, of acting out the role of someone who's never thought about these things when really they have, when really they've put quite a lot of thought into justifying why it is they eat meat, why it is they're not vegan. Sometimes people pretend they haven't thought it through. And in fact, they turn out to be ex-vegetarian or ex-vegan, or they had an ex-boyfriend who was vegetarian or vegan. They've put a lot of thought into it. But sometimes you really deal with people for whom these are just new and unfamiliar concepts. They've never applied their intelligence. They've never applied their powers of analysis to this part of their life at all. And then obviously you deal with a certain kind of reluctance on their part to look back and regret the ethical decisions they've made, let's say over 10 years leading up to the conversation you're having, and quite possibly including ethical decisions they made that same day, what they ate for lunch, and maybe you're having the conversation over dinner. Now, regret is already, I think, of tremendous philosophical significance, tremendous political significance. It's already a complex, difficult to understand topic that's very, very different from one culture to the next. Dealing with regret in a Japanese context in the 21st century, very different from a Western European context. And dealing with regret in Western Europe in the 21st century, very different from the 18th century, so on and so forth. What the process is of going into examining and recognizing the extent to which you yourself were wrong and you yourself were culpable. With examples like veganism, the quality of regret and the qualitative aspects of understanding why and how people refuse to reflect, refuse to analyze, refuse to take responsibility, refuse to regret. The qualitative aspects of the refusal to admit your own wrongdoing, they're extraordinary, and they're very difficult to compare to anything else. Now, to briefly digress, with the caveat already been stated, these things are quite specific to your culture, sometimes specific to your gender and ethnicity and subculture and so on and so forth. Like, I think it can be genuinely said that the concept of sin is very different in Judaism as opposed to Christianity. It may be very different in Catholicism than it is in Mormonism, or within Christianity, different contrasts could be drawn up. And by the same token, it can be said that Jewish people may experience regret and the reluctance to reflect on their own actions and regret them in a way that's really qualitatively different from a Catholic person, from a certain type of Protestant person, so on and so forth. With all those caveats have been stated, it's remarkable to me that I've spoken to so many cigarette smokers who could say with no hesitation, in a sense, they could say with no self-doubt, with no agony, that they regret smoking cigarettes for 10 years. And they don't feel weak when they're doing it. If anything, they feel strong. They look back and they say, this is this terrible thing that was such a big part of their life. Now, many of you might be thinking about the possibility of getting cancer, but that's only a possibility. A huge percentage of people who smoke cigarettes never get lung cancer. When I've spoken to people face to face, very often what they regret are things that actually did happen, things that weren't hypothetical. Just to give an example, saying, "Oh, I remember, fighting with my ex-girlfriend so much. I remember having to go outside and smoke cigarettes because my girlfriend didn't want me smoking in the apartment, and then I'd fight with her about that." So again, compared to dying of cancer, this may seem trivial, but if it goes on for 10 years, it's not a trivial part of your life. They look back and realize they were justifying all of these conflicts with their girlfriend. They were instigating, they were the cause of these conflicts with their girlfriend, and possibly conflicts with their parents, conflicts with their coworkers, conflicts with their boss. That these things all hinged on this habit they were attached to that now, in hindsight, they can look back on and regret. Okay, it's remarkable to me that people are so much more reluctant to engage in this kind of reflection and regret about the difference between a meat-eating diet and a vegan diet. And, even within my own culture, I have to ask, why? Why is it so different from smoking cigarettes? Why is it so hard for you people? And look, we all have different kinds of talents. Maybe I'm especially talented at regret. You know what I mean? Like, maybe that's one of my personal strengths, is I'm really good at regretting things, and maybe other people aren't. Now, I said before, actually a frighteningly small percentage of people have serious health consequences from smoking cigarettes. There may be smaller things they can notice. They may smoke cigarettes and notice it's harder for them to walk up a staircase. They may have these kinds of. It's kind of astounding, by contrast, what a large percentage of people have negative health consequences from eating a non-vegan diet, from eating meat, milk, eggs, etc. Melissa and I, we know an amazing variety of people who have had serious negative health consequences from eating meat, milk, dairy, and eggs, from eating cholesterol, in brief. And point one, we're not that old yet. When I'm in my 50s, when I'm in my 60s, how many of these people am I going to know, right? And point two, we don't know that many people. We don't have that many friends. We're not that well connected. If you have a huge social circle, a lot of people who've had heart attacks and other cholesterol-related ailments or what have you. Okay, well, it's a bigger survey. And I've got to say, it's really striking to me how reluctant they are to regret these decisions. Now, I said very briefly at the beginning of this video, regret is significant philosophically. Regret is significant politically. I knew a man, I honestly can't remember his name now. I'd have to go dig through my email history. And he was slightly famous in the history and politics of Cambodia. So he was famous to people like me, who really cared about the history and politics of Cambodia, and people who read English. Because with Cambodia, there are people who read in Cambodian, there are people who read English, and there are also people who read French. There's a big French language literature in Cambodia. It's kind of a different scene. The Francophone politics of Cambodia scene, real lively scene in Paris, and some of the suburbs that have a big Cambodian exile population, you can imagine. And it really haunted me, it really disturbed me that I had a direct eyewitness testimony from a very elderly man who'd known this white Western author about the history of Cambodia, who'd known him for many years. And this eyewitness told me, that guy, he really was pro-communist. He really did support the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot at a certain stage of that historical development. Now, I was kind of furious and astounded by this. This is my fundamental problem is I can't believe anyone would be that stupid. I'm in my 40s. I hope I'm over it now. But wow, it has been a struggle, and maybe it still is a struggle for me to really engage in discussion analysis instead with the profound assumption people can be that stupid, and you see things differently. But anyway, this guy, I'd read his work. I'd read his formally published, researched, written work. And what I couldn't accept about that wasn't that he had made a mistake and later changed his mind. It's that I had never seen him write a single word of regret. There are different forms of communism in the history of the world. But one of the most egregious, the most outrageous. If you knew someone and they'd been a communist in Japan in the 1930s, and then they changed their mind in the 1940s, okay, communism within Japan, okay, maybe they weren't so crazy, maybe it was bad. How is it possible for someone who could read and write the Cambodian language fluently, a highly educated, white Western man? How is it possible for this particular man to have supported Pol Pot, specifically the Khmer Rouge, specifically this extreme form of communism, specifically, and then in writing books about this stuff years later, to not have real soul searching, real regret? I mean, I want to see the agony on the page. I want to see it spilling out within. It's very, very alien to me. And I knew this guy to some extent. And I mean, look, the point of my telling this story now is really for me to just tell you how much that chewed me up, like how much that hurt me emotionally, that I didn't know how to deal with it. Now, some of you guys don't know much about the history of Cambodia, the history of communism in Cambodia. Okay. Some of you may have met people face to face in real life or here on the internet who, in a sense, are Nazis, people who are neo-Nazis, But those are mostly people who are just kind of playing a game with words and abstract ideas, and they may be trying to get followers on Instagram, and they may be trying to shock and horrify their own parents. There may be different kinds of games going on in their own head. It's very different to meet and talk to someone who was alive at that time, who was there, who was involved, who in that sense was a Nazi. And I'll tell you something, it doesn't really matter to me that much whether or not they literally have blood on their hands. Like if you met someone who was a journalist, but they were alive at that time, and they were a journalist supporting the Nazi party and supporting the atrocities, maybe that's much more disturbing. Maybe that's much worse than meeting and dealing with someone who was just a normal rank and file soldier, someone who just followed orders and pulled triggers in the army, fighting for the Nazi side. Okay, so my encounter with that particular scholar of Buddhism, scholar of the history of Cambodia, etc., covered all these bases to some extent. And really a Cambodian specialist. Sure, that's like the shocking discovery that someone really was a part of the Nazi party in that period when they had power, when they were committing atrocities. And, there are different ways to measure the number of people massacred, but the Khmer Rouge, they're one of the very few regimes in the history of the world that at least have a credible claim, like when being compared to the Nazis, like who was worse, the body count and the violence. It's so extraordinary and in such a short span of time. The Khmer Rouge are certainly on the list of the worst examples in the history of the human race. Were they actually worse than Adolf Hitler and the Nazis? Oh, it's certainly a judgment call. But anyway, they're in everybody's top 10 list for the worst examples of human nature, not just in the 20th century, but in the whole history of the human race. So, I'm aware that I kind of do live my life with this sort of unstated demand that there are things people ought to regret, and I have to admit, a certain kind of outrage. Not that people made mistakes, not that people made the wrong decisions. My outrage is knowing what you know now, looking back now. Why can't you regret it? I don't think I'm extraordinary in this respect, but I might be unusual in thinking it through in such a kind of crystal clear form and expressing it to my friends. You know what I mean? Expressing it to the people I know in my life, friends, relatives, colleagues, what have you. That's really a requirement I have with people in my life. It's one thing to do an evil act, and evil acts, they can be deeply personal. They can be very subtle. It can be just something you said to someone, in your own personal life, maybe in your professional life too, but might not be actions that have a body count or have easily palpable consequences. But, I think it's one thing for somebody to have said something that's really terrible, whether to you or to someone else. And it's another thing when you say to them afterwards, maybe days afterwards, maybe years afterwards, Look, looking back, don't you regret that now? Don't you regret, what you did? So, as I say, I think regret, it's tremendously significant philosophically, politically, and in this sense, uh, personally. You know, you are what you regret, maybe to a much greater extent than you are what you do, than you are what you know, what you learn. You know, you're very limited in what you can learn. We can all look back and regret our own ignorance. What it is you have the opportunity to learn, what has even occurred to you to research or look into or question. You can remain ignorant about things your whole life or for decades. Again, actually, veganism is a good example. I've met people who got to their later years, middle age or elderly, and they never questioned where milk comes from. They never questioned how cheese was made. They really never thought about it. It's they never asked the question. They never did a Google search. Where does cheese come from? How has this happened? That's very alien for me. I'm just a very curious person in that way. But, were they sincerely, you never thought about it? Okay, so, what it tells me a lot about you, but it doesn't tell me everything. What you do, the decisions you make, the actions you take, the initiative you show, tells me something about you. It doesn't tell me everything. But regret, what you regret and what you refuse to regret, it runs deep. It tells me a lot about who you are. And when you look in the mirror, for any of you, I think you feel me. I think you know what I'm talking about here. Whether they are things very personal and trivial in terms of their consequences, terrible things you did to someone else that may have just been words you've spoken, things that you've done that harm people, or very material things with real world palpable consequences. In our regrets, we reveal to ourselves and others who we really are. Now, I only know one person who took up the position of moral nihilism, or we could say moral aestheticism. I'm going to describe and define those terms just a second. Get into semantics in a second, but I only know one person who had adopted the position of moral nihilism and then switched to, went back to believing in moral realism. Moral realism here meaning that there is an objectively real sense in which something is morally good, morally evil, good or bad. And that is, I have to admit to myself, that is strange and disturbing to me in the same sort of way that somebody being ex-vegan, someone who's lived as a vegan, let's say for 2 years, and then makes the decision to go back to eating meat, that's more disturbing to me than someone who's just never thought about it, who's never been vegan at all. And again, in some cases, you have to accept, never thought about it, it can really mean never gave any thought to it, never made excuses, never analyzed it. People can live in total ignorance. Well, if you were vegan for 2 years and I saw you come on YouTube and give arguments in favor of veganism, I saw you refute arguments against veganism, it's very hard for me to accept that now you've switched sides. It's much harder for me. It's more disturbing for me, right? And yes, in most cases, the people's reasons are just laughable. They're just ridiculous. They are reasons that nobody could or should take seriously. It's still disturbing for me. It's still upsetting for me. Do you think my father had good reasons for supporting Joseph Stalin? No, they were laughable. I mean, even for a child, I could refute them as a child. Do you think my father had good reasons for supporting Mao Zedong and his massacres? No. Right? Still disturbing. It's still upsetting, right? And why? Because those are excuses he lived by. Those ideas, those decisions, those moral compromises, those beliefs, if you like, had real world consequences. So no matter how stupid, no matter how preposterous, no matter how laughable they are, right? It's still upsetting, still disturbing, it still matters. And I tell you, it still matters to me. So I have to take a moment here, I think, to describe to you, and this may be the most important part of the video for many of you, the sense in which nihilism matters in ethics. Because I think it really does matter. I don't think this is just a philosophical, this isn't a philosophical parlor trick. This isn't a game being played on a chalkboard that doesn't have consequences for people in their real lives. And I'm going to say something for this. This is the most flattering thing I can say about the other side of this argument. The arguments in favor of eating meat are fundamentally just boring to me. Like, they're really not interesting. They're not really worth thinking about or understanding in depth. The arguments people give to justify smoking marijuana, I also find incredibly boring. I mean, they really, in most cases, both the justifications for eating meat and the justifications for smoking marijuana, they don't amount to much more than people enjoy them, and whatever they enjoy, they're going to make excuses for. It's not there. I've got to tell you something. The excuses for and the justifications for moral realism, they are interesting. And I can even say that they are important. This is a rare case of an argument where, from my perspective as a nihilist, I can really say I think that both sides of the argument are worth hearing and worth understanding and worth treating in some depth. Now, I admit I haven't described or defined it yet. Moral realism, of course it's wrong. Of course, it's almost laughably self-evidently wrong. In what sense can one moral judgment be correct and true for all people at all times, in the same way that a law of physics like gravity is correct and true for all people at all times, regardless of whether or not you're living in a culture that understands gravity, whether or not you're living in a culture that even has words in its own language for gravity, or let alone science and specific mathematical formula to quantify gravity. I mean, another example here is the value of pi, not PIE, but PI. There are these mathematical relationships between geometric figures, and you can say, in a sense, this is true in all times for all people in all places. Now, another one that's actually a little bit more dubious. People make these claims about music also. Anthropologists dug up, I think it was a flute made of bone. I'm sorry, I believe it was more than 10,000 years ago. It was really, really ancient. And they were able to scan it with some kind of computer technology. So it's a bone, and it had been hollowed out in the middle, and holes had been drilled in it to make a flute. And so, I'm sorry, but let's say it was 10,000 years ago for the sake of argument. And they were able to prove that already at that time, before the development of writing, before the development of our culture and civilization, human beings already had the same sense of tune and harmony, that some of the properties of music were already true at this, the idea of what the gap should be between two notes or two octaves or something. There were some things that were consistent and true. Well, all right. Now, we can argue against this. The idea of what music or harmony is or ought to be, was it really the same in ancient China, ancient India, ancient Europe? And those are just examples of music, because we have written records for these things, for what music was in ancient China. We have evidence to work from. What music was in ancient Australia, the Indigenous people of Australia, another interesting question. But anyway, this idea of something being objectively real, and that morality and that the judgments of ethics and the distinction between good and evil, right and wrong, that this can be true at all times for all people. I think what makes it interesting, what makes it worthwhile to really think through that side of the argument very thoroughly, even though it's incorrect, is closely parallel to the way in which gender equality may be descriptively false, but still have a kind of prescriptive value. This is going to be much easier to understand with examples than abstract reasoning. Let's say we have a society that decides equality between the genders is really important. So therefore, when people apply to work for the fire department, we are going to have exactly the same tests applied to men and women. Now, some of those tests are intellectual, but a lot of the tests for working in the fire department, for being a fireman, as we still say, it's a gender-specific term, they deal with your ability to, for example, lift another human being and carry them out of a room or carry them out of a building, perhaps when surrounded by smoke and fire, perhaps in very difficult circumstances. A lot of brute strength involved. Right? So if we commit to the abstract idea of gender equality, and that can be stated in the following format. It can be stated as committing to the axiom that men and women are equal. Now, do we really mean that? What if what we really mean is that men and women should be treated as if they're equal, even when there are some inequalities? Right? Well, a counter argument, which probably wherever you're living in the world, whether in Europe or North America, not if you live in Saudi Arabia, not if you live in Afghanistan, but many of you are living in parts of the world that had to address this as a real world problem debate. Because if you embrace gender equality in that sense, then the result will be that you have astoundingly few women working in the fire department. Some women will be able to pass the same tests as the men. Some. However, the women, the tiny minority of women who are strong enough to meet those standards, they instead have the option of being an Olympic athlete. Like, this is part of your competing. There are a lot of really good jobs those women can have. And then you get into this in the military also. Like, okay, well, if you're only interested in women who are over 6 feet tall, who can do a certain number of chin-ups, they exist. Some women are stronger than some men and whatever. Well, that tiny minority of women have a lot of really interesting job opportunities in life. That's why they may not be willing to become a fireman, as we still say, fire worker. What should I say now? A fire extinguishment employee, and they may not be willing to work for the military. So if that's the principle of gender equality that you take and put into practice, right, the outcomes may be unequal. They may exacerbate inequality. The result is that in the entire fire department, you have 800 men and only 5 women, or you may have 0. It's hard to deal with. It's really hard to deal with. Now, at the opposite extreme, and I have lived in places where this was an ongoing controversy, they have systems where, for the sake of gender equality, they have unequal standards for men and women. And they have the same tests, but it's, if you're a woman, you have to lift less weight and you have to run up and down fewer stairs while carrying less weight and this kind of thing. Well, the result of that policy is more women are employed by the fire department. Mm-hmm. But when a house is actually on fire, right, if someone is lying on the floor choking and they need a fireman to lift them and carry them out of the building, right, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. That's the task confronting you. Now, I say this honestly. Look, I'm going to go further. I think if you have a human heart, you have to have mixed feelings about this. There has to be part of you that wishes we could have a fire department that's 50% men and 50% women, or 55-45. That's nearly 50-50. That would be better. That would be good. It would be a better world if that were possible. And it's difficult to have the sort of sang-froid, to just accept living in a totally unequal world where you say, well, the only really thing that matters for this job is that you can lift and carry someone out of a fire. And if we need people who have that kind of brute strength and who are willing to work at this relatively low wage, because again, there are women who can do that, but they may be Olympic athletes. They may be working just as fitness models or what have you. They have all kinds of different job opportunities in front of them, the tiny minority of women who could compete at that level. And then you end up with a 100% male workforce in some of these jobs, with that being justified paradoxically by commitment to gender equality. So this is the sense in which the idea of moral realism remains interesting and worthwhile to contemplate and philosophize about, and so on and so forth, even if it's false, right? So even if the claim that women and men are equally strong is false, i.e., when you look at a population of 10 million people, how many women are strong enough to do the job of firemen and how many men are, the available labor pool, it's not equal. Right? But there's still a sense in which it's interesting and worth talking about whether or not we ought to politically organize the fire department on the basis of gender equality. Um, in the same way, I think the perennial appeal, in every sense of the word perennial, the perennial appeal of moral realism is that the world would be a better place and that our own lives would be better as individuals, just in our own psychology, in our own reflections, in our own thoughts and dreams and so on, in our own private reflections and reverie, that it would be better if we lived according to this fixed standard, if we lived according to this notion of moral realism. Now, I've already said that's not what I believe. I don't subscribe to, I don't support that tenet or that claim. But I think it's interesting enough, and I think it's important enough to really be taken seriously. And it's sort of like ethical Kantianism, in that no matter how laughable it might be, no matter how easily refuted it might be, it is something that's perennially going to come up again and again. What do I mean by Kantianism? Specifically in ethics, one of the ideas Kant is most famous for, Immanuel Kant, is that now this, I'm just thinking, this video is going to be demonetized because I pronounced his name Kant rather than Kant. One of his most influential ideas is that what is immoral for one person to do is immoral for everyone to do. That if you wouldn't approve of everyone doing a certain action, then you shouldn't do it yourself. So if you feel that you personally would prefer not to fight in the war, but you think it would be unethical for everyone to refuse to be drafted to fight in the war, this is a sort of Kantian problem. It's very simplistic. Now, look, as I said, this is actually very, very easy to refute. Not everyone is a medical doctor. Not everyone has two legs. There are actually very good reasons why the moral standards and decisions that apply to me or that I make may not apply to another person. I mean, there are real reasons for subjective factors to intervene, why you in particular may be justified in making a moral decision that you would disapprove of in others. So, but still, I think that a lot of people do live with, frankly, an almost magnetic sense of being moved and guided by that kind of Kantian way of thinking. If I couldn't approve of someone else doing this action, how dare I approve of doing it myself? This comes up a lot. Many years ago, we talked about minimalism on the channel. It was probably because I had one supporter of the channel. Shout out to Jake Eames, who was very consumed by this at the time. There are people who really are consumed and haunted by this notion that, oh, well, I wouldn't approve of someone else using this disposable bag, using this disposable light bulb, using this disposable plastic spoon. I wouldn't approve of 1 million people or 1 billion people doing this thing that has some negative ecological outcome. Therefore, I have to live my whole life devoted to basically coming into a kind of consistency with what I think an idealized person should do and what I think should be universally prescriptive behavioral requirements that all people ought to follow. So again, this is an example of something that it does haunt people. Now, again, it's been many, many years ago. I don't have to go into it now. From my perspective, it's childishly simple to overturn. But even if I overturn it, it still matters to people. It still means that people. It still has consequence in people's lives. Well, if you have just signed up to fight in the U.S. Army against the Taliban, if you are in the middle of that war, yeah, you have to be willing to eat food that comes in disposable packaging, right? So MRE is the abbreviation, which stands for meals ready to eat. War involves plastic forks and plastic knives. Do you want to win this war or not? Now there are a lot of other ethical compromises you make in war, but if you are making the commitment that it's worthwhile for you personally and for 20 other men who are in your battalion or something, you think it's worthwhile for you to go to this small village in Afghanistan and fight this battle. It's completely preposterous for you to lose the battle or indeed surrender to the other side because you will not use a plastic fork. You will not use a plastic knife. You will not use disposable packaging for your food. Well, guess what? This can be generalized. I want to write a book. I'm going to use up a bunch of pencils and paper. It's not the case. In my situation, I don't disapprove of other people using pencils and paper. I don't disapprove of other people using plastic forks. But for many people, they're committed to a minimalist ideal, and they're not thinking of this in a way that is relative to the goal they're pursuing or the outcome they're pursuing. They're instead thinking of it in this Kantian way, generalizing, to this massive extent about what all humanity ought to do. And then they feel beholden to this notion of what all humanity ought to do, that they ought to live up to it or live down to it as a kind of minimum standard. I'm looking at the comments here, but I don't think there's anything here that should derail my monologue. I do see your comments coming, guys. I appreciate them. If you have a second to hit the thumbs up button, it'll help people find the video, both while it's being recorded and after. Melissa, you want to jump in?
It is a very minor thing, but
good. Minor or major? Hit it.
I felt there was no good time for me to interrupt your monologue, but a gender-neutral term for fireman would be firefighter.
Firefighter. Why don't you put on these lights for me? Why don't you put on that one and that one? Because it's getting dimmer now. We actually have the snow falling. And the one right above you? Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's enough. Okay. Okay, I'll read and respond to some of these comments. But if there's anything else you want to say, babe, if you want to jump on that, I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to be distracted with that one. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good point. When people think in generalities about feminism, about equality of gender, that's a very good example to use. I respect that.
Right. Well, look, people at a very deep level, they want to presume that the more generalized an argument is, the more powerful it is. The closer they come to writing a law of physics, that something's a universal axiom. And you have to, with maturity, appreciate that the opposite is true. The more precise and particular and incisive your arguments are, the more particular. So one of my ex-girlfriends, this is many, many years ago, before I met Melissa and before I met the woman who became my first wife and my first ex-wife, many, many years ago, I remember she asked me a challenging question about how I would teach morality to my own daughter if in future I had a daughter. And I'm forgetting the precise word she used, but she meant morality in relation to sex before marriage, in relation to whether or not you'd have an abortion if you got accidentally pregnant, morality in this province, which, stereotypically and actually is very often something the father sits down and talks through with the daughter. And the answer I gave her really shocked her and really impressed her. And I said, the answer I gave her was, it depends on the particular girl. And I was able to say I knew her and I knew her sister to some extent. I said, look at you and look at your sister. You're blood related and you grew up in the same household and you're such totally different people. What I would have to say to you about sexuality and ethics and what have you, like, if you were my daughter or what have you, it's totally different from what I would say to your sister. And it's true, they were two sisters who were really very, very different people. Now, as you can imagine, the conversation went further from there, but I was making the fundamental point that what would be really traumatic and difficult to deal with for one girl is something that another would kind of take in stride and laugh at, and wouldn't be flummoxed by or wouldn't be slowed down by at all. There really are, in this province, it's worth time, but there are things that are really, really different. Now, I talk about this sort of thing in my book, using some much more erudite and less sexy, allegories and metaphors. But, how you teach politics to someone who has a tremendously energetic, risk-taking character, someone who is willing to, and maybe someone who already repeatedly has risked their life by committing to an extreme course of action in politics, that may be very different from how you teach politics to someone who's fundamentally a lazy, stubborn, conflict-avoiding person. We can come up with any number of people. But, if I'm really teaching politics, if I'm really teaching morality, if I'm really teaching philosophy, what if the most important thing to recognize isn't this objective and even transcendental sense of right and wrong, good and evil? What if what's really powerful is understanding in this particular and incisive and analytical way, who I'm teaching and to what outcome, So, and this, what I've just said to you, doesn't come to anyone naturally. This is not, this is old man's wisdom here. I think nobody realizes this at, say, age 11. And then maybe a few people realize it at age 16 and more people realize at age 26. Oh, wow. Because I think it is really natural, no matter what your upbringing, whether you're raised Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, or totally nihilistic atheist. I think it's natural to cling to that idea of a law of physics. Even if you don't have the words for that, you didn't grow up with that in your tradition, something that's true for everyone at all times, no exception, that's strength, that's power, and not this business of being like a tailor. And when someone walks into your tailor shop and they say they want to buy a shirt, you don't say, oh, well, this is the best shirt. You start by taking a look at them. It's like, okay, what's the right shirt for you? I've got to tell you, that seems weak from a childish perspective or from a teenage perspective, but you get more mature and you realize that's the real strength that matters.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't want to derail you
Good.
your main topic, but just responding to that, I think it also goes up against our ideas of standardized education.
Yes.
So recently I have been thinking
that's a really deep point, actually. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yes, recently I've been thinking about my education and seeing how, if I would have had the right inputs, how I would have approached things differently in innumerable ways. But because the education was standardized, because we all had to reach these benchmarks at the right time.
No. I mean, you're right. What I was saying is a kind of law of physics mentality. Right. Really, it's much more directly an extension of the standardized system of education mentality. Yeah. And certainly when I was growing up, I was really keenly aware of that our sense of what was right and wrong as children was in large part based on how we felt the teachers ought to behave, how they ought to treat us. And even though we were aware of things that were unfair, that we, and it's very easy as a child to think, well, we ought to all write the same exam and it all ought to be graded fairly for all of us. These are some of the first meditations on justice and injustice that we have as children, and their influence lasts a very long time. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how do you grade all essays in the class the same? I mean, it's
right.
When it's something creative.
Well, let's give just two really simple examples. Aristotle is very interested in the question of at what age do you teach math to a child? At what age do you teach spelling, reading, and writing? At what age do you teach music to a child? Now, basically every country in the world coming with a standardized system of education that, well, the correct answer is it's not going to be the same for all children, right? Like really, if you're working on a system of one-to-one tutorial, whereas one tutor working with one child for each of those subjects, maybe this child can start learning math at age 6, and this one at age 4, and this one at age 8, and genuinely for their benefit. I don't just mean pandering to them or something, like where really it's not going to be the same. But physical education, I saw an interview with a guy who became an Olympic athlete. I'm sorry, I forget all the sports he played, but he was in many different sports, and he was so enormous compared to children his own age that parents would complain, why do you have a child from the 8th grade playing with the 4th graders? You know what I mean? Like when he was in 4th grade, people assumed he was many years older than the other children. And then just a couple years later, the complaints instead from parents were, why is there an adult playing with the children? Why is there a grown man playing with children? So he was someone who went through puberty at a very, very early age relative to the other kids in his grade. And he was something of a giant. And as I say, went on to become an athlete. Well, if you're training someone as an individual, if you're training someone even just for a sport, that's one thing. And when instead you have a standardized system of education, you say, okay, so grade 4, now we're all going to learn volleyball. Well, maybe some people were ready to learn volleyball 2 years earlier and some 2 years later. These are simple and crude things, but unfortunately, the implications are actually deep and vast. and go on forever. They go on for the rest of their lives. So yeah, somebody was making a comment about equality versus equity, and left-wing feminism and so on and so forth. Well, yeah, I think this is probably this is deep and shallow at the same time. The way that most people are thinking about equality most of the time has to do with the education system, either how their teachers did treat them or how they thought their teachers ought to treat them. Either what the exams really were or what the exams ought to be. That there should be one standard for everyone at all times. And yeah, I think that does actually get to the root of the belief in objective morality, about good and evil being objectively real. Wouldn't it be reassuring if the difference between good and evil had this same kind of quality, which again is introduced to us in this convincing and coercive way by the formal education system? Okay, interesting question from Bonjour Trieste, Bonjour Tristesse. Distinction with the difference. Bonjour Tristesse asks, quote, is the main meaningful difference between a moral absolutist saying their stance is law and a nihilist saying their subjective stance ought to be law, that the nihilist is capable of changing his or her position? Okay, so great question. I wonder if you've read some chapters of my book. I'm writing a book that's not published yet, but I've shared some chapters. If not, you will very much find the answer to this question in my book. And I'm wondering if you've read the book, because your way of phrasing the question is kind of right up my alley. It's very much how I like to deal with these things. So in my book, No More Manifestos, there are some portions of the book that are negative in the sense of explaining to you, explaining to you what it is I'm opposed to, what it is I'm against, explaining to you what is bad and evil and wrong. But there are also portions of the book that I think are very clearly marked out as positive, where I'm telling you, look, this is what my philosophy is about positively. Not just these are the advantages of my philosophy, this is how it's going to make your life better, but positively, this is what I'm preaching in this sense. And the positive aspects of nihilism are explained in one chapter. So in a sense, the whole book is talking about nihilism, but some chapters more than others. Has a lot of ground to cover, the book. But one of the chapters expresses it in a protracted allegory of two bakeries. One bakery that's run by true believers and one that's run by nihilists. So obviously this is a hypothetical thought exercise that will never exist in the real world. But the bakery that is run by believers, they believe they know what good bread is. They believe they know what a good croissant is. They believe they know what a good brioche is. They have a sort of written constitution. They have a tradition they're beholden to, and they say there is one way to bake this product, and we have to live up to that standard. We're beholden to that standard forever. So their idea of good bread is not based on what the customers like. It doesn't change from one decade to the next or 1 month to the next about what customers like. Another good example would be a birthday cake. Like they can just keep on making birthday cakes the same way, and it's not going to change the fashion, right? They have a notion set in stone. Now, this may sound preposterous, but if you know people in cuisine, plenty of people in cuisine are like this. They'll tell you they run a traditional Hungarian bakery, what have you. They'll tell you, that we at this bakery carry on the tradition of Parisian bread from the such and such arrondissement, from the such and such century. They have a specific notion of baking, of the art of baking, that they are working hard to continue and promulgate for future generations. And they don't care if it's out of style. They don't care if it's unpopular. They don't care if that's not the kind of bread people want to eat and it's not the kind of brioche people want to eat. I present there in a sophisticated way the type of doubt that nihilists live with, and then the type of innovation that comes out of that doubt. where you are willing to say to yourself, even with something as tangible as bread, well, I don't know what good bread is. And I don't know what the right recipe is for the winter of 2022. I'm not sure we're doing this the right way. I'm not sure we're approaching this problem the right way. I'm willing to ask new questions. I'm willing to do new research. I'm willing to innovate, and I'm willing to experiment. And my experiments may have risks involved, right? Like I'm willing to try things that are new and different, and I'm willing to fail a few times before I get it right. So, you've asked a good question. Is it just that the nihilist is capable of changing? And now, by the way, the relationship between belief and law, the relationship between nihilism and law, many chapters in my book talk about that in great depth. So, I mean, if you read the whole book, you'll know everything I have to say about law, the justice system, the court system, the police, the Constitution, and belief and nihilism being counterposed. This is a huge portion of what the book deals with. Although the book is also, in large part, a thesis on the philosophy of education and the reform of education. So, say it has a lot to cover. Okay, change is objectively real. Progress is a shadow of our ideologies. It's a shadow cast by our ideological convictions, I might say, to be more precise. What about innovation? What if the most important difference is the willingness to innovate, and even the desire and the motivation to innovate, right? And you used the term moral absolutist. I actually haven't used it in the video before reading your question. Totally fine term to use, just not the term I was using. When you think about moral absolutists, what is the role for innovation from the perspective of moral absolutism? Now, look at the Taliban. It's not a lot of capacity for innovation there. And, for long centuries, you can look at the Catholic Church. And, these may seem like cartoonish examples of moral absolutism. When you know people on a one-to-one basis, they may have forms of moral absolutism that are more, I don't know, they fit more seamlessly into our 21st century liberal society. But nevertheless, their lack of capacity for innovation, their reluctance to innovate, and indeed, what I said at the beginning of this video, their reluctance to regret anything. Talked a lot about the significance of the reluctance to look back on mistakes and regret. This is a big difference that has big implications for people's lives as individuals, and when you scale it up and talk about society as a whole. You want to say something?
Yeah, just getting back on that topic of the man who supported Pol Pot, that supported the Khmer Rouge, and how still I think today communism tends to have this revolutionary quality to it, that it's a new thing, at least to me. Like, I still think it has this. But it is not a nihilist. It is not a nihilistic idea, communism. It is an ideology still, and it has all the problems of committing to an ideology of belief in systems. So I guess I don't really have a question.
Right. So I can formulate this question though. No, I see what you're getting at. So look, I'm going to talk about communism economically because it's more palpable. The same way I was talking about bread as something you can see and touch. But what I'm about to say is not merely true about economics. It's true of religion and not just political ideology also. When you go to the grocery store and you see 10 different brands of orange juice, or maybe 20 different brands of orange juice, depending on where you are in the size of the grocery store, see many different varieties of orange juice. It is very easy for a communist to say, it's very easy for a Marxist to say, that orange juice would be cheaper and the economy would be more efficient as a whole if the government shut down 19 out of the 20 orange juice companies, centralized the production and distribution of orange juice. So you get just one national orange juice company, right? And then you can imagine the advantages in terms of economies of scale, in terms of reduced waste, better distribution. And you can look into it. There will be some advantages, not dramatic in terms of production, because ultimately there were farms that are growing oranges and there were factories processing it into juice. But you can say, okay, now we can reorganize all these things. And in the short term, you can gain an advantage in efficiency. Maybe you can produce cheaper orange juice for people. The problem is this is just one step. This is just a single stage of analysis. This is just a single stage of transformation. It's much more difficult to see that over a period of 50 years, genuinely the free market competition between 20 different orange juice companies that actually is producing the possibility of innovation all the time. Now, just imagine, I said producing the possibility of innovation. It's possible there's no innovation. It's possible, but I can't say it makes innovation inevitable. There is some innovation. There is some adaptation going on all the time. And when you close that down, then instead you have none. Now, just say, an example I talked about in my channel years ago was the indigenous religion of Taiwan. So the religion of the indigenous people of Taiwan prior to the arrival of Christian missionaries, which, by the way, is not the same as what religion was in mainland China at that time. Very different people speaking a different language, a different culture, so on and so forth. Now, the indigenous religion they had was so horrible that you can easily make an argument that their quality of life improved by converting to Christianity. I'm not going to get into details. You might, I mean, for the sake of hypothetical argument, you can just imagine the most horrible religion in the world where Christianity is a positive alternative in terms of people's actual lived experience. Okay, this is a single stage of analysis, right? Even though Christianity and even the total conversion of society, let's say they embrace Christianity to the same extent as the Dark Ages in Europe, you could full-on medieval repressive control of Christianity. Okay, with just a single stage of analysis, we can talk about the advantages. But over 50 years and over 500 years, what you're losing is the potential for innovation. That actually the best thing for the people of Taiwan and the best thing for the people of ancient Greece and ancient Rome is, if you're going to have religion, to have 20 different religions all competing with each other, each one criticizing the other. And, and really, I mean, competing, it can often be in a very direct sense where, one religion invites you to attend a feast or a ceremony. And you say, oh, no, I can't go because there's this other religion with this other ceremony. And they really make the case, oh, no, you should come to our religion, not that one. Ours is, Now, of course, for me as a nihilist, you can talk about, I mean, then you have a very different question. Would you be better having 20 competing and relatively weak religions, or 0, have absolutely everyone subscribe to the philosophy of Mazard? Fortunately, this is not a real world problem. The reality is we have a choice between, do you want to have a society like Saudi Arabia, or do you want to have a society like the United States of America or Denmark, where the philosophy of Mazard gets to compete with many other religions? Now, again, unfortunately, in the United States of America, it's not 20 small religions. The Christian church is enormous and very powerful, and then you get it's not as bad as Saudi Arabia, but very, very far from ideal. Indeed, anywhere you might live, take a look at. Oh God, Pao Simeon is in the audience. What a joke! They let you out of the psych ward, huh, Pao? I haven't heard from you in a long time. Right. So no, this is pretty important. So, babe, if you live in Utah and you want to put your kids into a school, how many schools do you have to choose from? Now, in Utah, you have Mormon, but probably in Utah, you've got Mormon, Catholic, and maybe 1 or 2 Protestant denominations. That's all I'm saying is the number of religions that are at that level of institutional development and, frankly, economic power. It's the amount of money they have, the amount of land they own, these kinds of things. I used to be a Buddhist. I used to be a Theravada Buddhist. And I had to ask the question, well, where are Buddhists supposed to send their kids to school? Where in America is there a Theravada Buddhist school your children can attend? So no, Theravada Buddhism does exist within America. It's not 0, but it's incredibly marginalized. And Buddhists have to make hard choices about that, where they're going to send their kids to school. So no, this is just to make it palpable, make it easily understandable. But yeah, many parts of the United States, you're down to just 2 or 4 churches that have any kinds of power. And although that'll be different from one part of America to the other, certainly, I heard an autobiographical statement from somebody recently whose childhood was totally dominated by Scientology, and he grew up in just the right neighborhood of Los Angeles. His parents chose to live there intentionally, where Scientology was this dominant force in people's lives. He was sent to Scientology schools. Scientology is a dangerous cult, in case you didn't know. It really is. It really is a terrible religion. So yeah, what those choices are will differ from one place to the other. Anyway, yeah. So I'm pointing out the difference in terms again. This video, as I've phrased it, is contrasting moral realism to nihilism. And I should talk about moral aestheticism kind of in between what exactly that means. But the term used here by Bonjour Tristesse is asking about moral absolutism. And yeah, I think I've illustrated now sufficiently what the negative knock-on consequences are of moral absolutism, even when there is a short-term advantage. So now Melissa raised the issue of communism. Communism is a very useful example because communists are moral absolutists. They're not moral relativists, et cetera, et cetera. It's a system of moral absolutism, and they do indeed believe there's a sort of transcendental and eternal sense of good and evil, right and wrong. I know too much about Marxism, so I can now digress into the details of the arguments they would make against that claim. But anyway, I'm not going to, But yeah, as I say, in the same sense that communism snuffs out the competition between different brands of orange juice by giving you just one brand of orange juice, they're also snuffing out the competition between a lot of different ideas, ideologies, political ideas, philosophies, beliefs, and the capacity for criticism and doubt and cross-examination to break beliefs and assumptions apart and challenge them with something new. So in that sense, it's a sort of classical, old-fashioned form of moral absolutism that has these terrible disadvantages. Okay, so I've made the concession that I do think that moral absolutism is it's worth thinking about, and it's worth taking seriously. I don't think the excuses people make for gambling are really worth thinking about, worth taking seriously. I don't think the excuses people make for smoking marijuana or eating meat are worth thinking about, worth taking seriously. And again, I admit there's this one person I know on the internet where it really did sort of disturb me to see that he went from espousing moral relativism, moral aestheticism. He switched sides and went back to saying that he instead believes now in moral absolutism. And by the way, he didn't convert to Christianity or Islam or anything like that. There were no religious trappings, but he switched over to the view that differences between right and wrong are fixed and real, in the same sense that the laws of physics are fixed and real, and the law of gravity is eternal, regardless of what opinions human beings might make up about it. Now, I'm going to argue against my own position. I think the reluctance to deal with nihilism and to deal with moral aestheticism, that I'll here get into a little bit more. Moral aestheticism is almost nihilism, but not quite. It's going 80% or 90% of the way towards total nihilism. I think it is identical to our reluctance to feel regret. If you believe that there is one standard of beauty that is true at all times and at all cultures for all people, if you think that the difference between something being beautiful and something being ugly is real, in the same way that the law of gravity is real, in the same way that different principles of geometry are real at all times for all people, you can look back at the history of the world and you can regret periods of time when people were in error or when the vast majority of people are in error. But you're only regretting it sometimes, not all the time. You then also get to feel the joy and exaltation or affirmation of your own ego when you feel that the tide of history is on your side, or whatever you want to say. When you feel that the opinions and values of your fellow human beings are affirming your own position. Again, there are many things about this that are ridiculous. If you believe there is one set of aesthetic ideas that define what is good in architecture, well, there are many centuries in the history of China when people's idea of what good architecture was is totally contrary to your own. You're claiming it's immortal and true for all people at all times, but people are capable of living in error about it for centuries or perhaps forever. And they can be in error in 50% of the world and not in the other 50% of the world. And the 50% of the world that's wrong doesn't see any advantage in the 50% that's right. It does lead to some very strange contradiction in life. But by contrast, my position of nihilism means that you're basically always looking back and regretting and doubting everything. That you're living your life with this kind of profound openness to the possibility that you are wrong and that you don't really know what's right and you don't know what the right decision was. And all you can really do is analyze what the presuppositions were, however asinine, however stupid, and however brilliant, that went into why people made the decisions that they did at the time, whether you're talking about yourself or about other people. Now, I'll give you an example of how this really is part of our day-to-day life, because obviously most people do not talk about architecture this way. I've met some who do. I've known some architects. I've known some people who talk about architecture passion. There are people who talk about the history of architecture that way, and sculpture and art. There are. There's a whole department for those people at the university. And it's not the Department of Psychology. It's not the psych ward. It's very comforting for people to be able to look back at the history of the last 10 years now and say that clearly there is a morally real difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. That clearly the morally good person or the morally better person is an objectively real fact was Hillary Clinton. And that clearly the morally, again, in this sense of something being real in the same way that one of the laws of physics is real, that, the real truth is that people ought to have voted for Hillary Clinton and not for Donald Trump. Well, I don't live my life that way. I don't think that way, not even in my private thoughts and not even with my conversations with close personal friends. Most of you probably also know some very bad things about Hillary Clinton. I know some very bad things about Hillary Clinton. I know some things that are some kind of terrifyingly immoral decisions she made before she became a candidate for president. I know some terribly immoral things she did before her husband, Bill Clinton, became president. And yes, y'all, she made some shockingly immoral decisions during her competition with Bernie Sanders for who would be the candidate to become president of the United States. How quickly we forget. But if you're drawing up an assessment of Hillary Rodham Clinton's ethical character, and then you're making predictions about what kind of president of the United States she would have been or what the consequences of that would have been, there are really worrying, really terrifying signs that she could have been even worse than Donald Trump. I'm not joking. Now, my point here is not that I'm right and you're wrong. My point is that I don't know, and that I'm willing to live with that doubt. I'm willing to live with a kind of perpetual doubt and perpetual regret. This is many steps beyond skepticism. This is nihilism, And again, even if I'm just talking to a personal friend, even if I'm talking to my own mother or something, like there's no political, I'm not performing for an audience. And when I'm just thinking to myself, I do not think in terms of dogmatic certainty that way. I don't look back at something as obvious as the election of Donald Trump and say, oh, well, that was obviously a disaster because Donald Trump is obviously an evil and immoral and stupid person. And obviously there is some objectively real, sense in which the morally right thing to do was to vote for Hillary Clinton, or the morally right thing to do or that there's some real sense in which Hillary Clinton is morally good. Again, with the word "real" meaning like the laws of physics, and that's not just something that's not just known or measurable objectively, but something that really exists at all times in all cultures. That's not relative to my subjective judgment. It's not relative to my taste. It's not relative to the times we're living in. It's not relative to the objective you're trying to pursue. Right? Like if you're recruiting people to play on your basketball team, who is the best basketball player? It may be relative to me and my taste, but it's also relative to the objective stated of who can shoot a basketball. I do not know if Hillary Clinton is better on a basketball team than Donald Trump, but obviously this framework provides us with a very different set of, yes, in some ways objective measurements about who is good and who is bad and so on. So, my point is this. In the same way that people live their lives with an almost magnetic feeling of being drawn to some of these principles from the Kantian tradition, this idea of what you claim to be true for yourself ought to be something that's true for all people. If you feel something is good for you, it should be good for everyone, and so on and so forth. And that you wouldn't ever do an act that you would consider evil for someone else to do, so on and so forth. Likewise, I think that people want to escape from this sense of doubt. They want to escape from this sense of regret. And so that drives them toward the belief in objective morality, thinking that morality is objectively real. Oh, I'm just taking a second to glance at your comments. Melissa, if you want to chime in now. So Rafa in the audience, welcome to the audience, Rafa. I don't remember talking to you ever, but anyway, I'm sorry if you've been here before. I don't recall your name and your photograph of yourself. Rafa asks, quote, as a nihilist, do you think that there is a moral imperative towards innovation? Isn't that a belief to improve society and humanity as a whole is good? So Rafa, the kinds of decisions you have to make as a nihilist are of the following kind. Would you, Rafa, prefer to go on vacation in Thailand or Saudi Arabia? Now, I am not here making the claim that this is a good example for moral realism. Is Thailand a morally good country? We could raise a whole lot of different questions to controvert the claim that Thailand is morally good. They have a very high rate of murder, a very high rate of prostitution, a very high rate of drug use, alcoholism. There are a lot of social problems in Thailand. Right? We can go into a critique of you could even go into the advantages that Saudi Arabia has over Thailand. I've met people who lived and worked in Saudi Arabia. I don't know if I could say any of them liked it, but they did recognize that there were advantages to living there. Well, the decision I have to make is where am I going to go on vacation? And despite all the problems Thailand has, including problems with the actual, design of its parliament, its military, the power and control of the royal family, in contrast to the military and the elected system of government. I know a fair bit about Thai politics, more than most white people who speak English. Okay, I can tell you all these things that are wrong with Thailand. I'd rather go on vacation in Thailand. Now, what if I have to live there for 5 years? Would I have to live there for 10 years? Would you rather live for 10 years in Thailand or 10 years in Saudi Arabia? Now, let's ask the question of what if you are a citizen of Denmark? Do you want the future of Denmark to be more like Saudi Arabia or be more like Thailand? These are the questions we get into. Now, again, it's totally fine. I don't mind the challenge. You ask about improving society, okay? Now, sometimes the limits of the language being what they are, I do use the word improvement. I don't treat this as a word I refuse to use for some logical reason or something, as some philosophical parlor trick. I'm not afraid of the word improvement. But what I'm saying to you sincerely is this. If you're working in a bakery and you want to try something new and you want to try something different, you don't know whether it is an improvement or not. Innovation really is incompatible with the concept of improvement, even though, you know, we treat them as almost synonymous. Like, you want to have innovations in the system of education. Well, are those innovations going to be an improvement or not? They're going to be an experiment. And an experiment, by definition, is something where the outcomes are unknown. So if I'm running a bakery, I can try 12 different things this month, and I can fail 12 times before coming up with a recipe that really works on the 13th time. You know, that's innovation. All right. Now, I do not think stasis is an option. I don't think Saudi Arabia has the option to stay the same. I don't think Afghanistan has the option to stay the same. I think Afghanistan's going to change. I think Saudi Arabia is going to change, whether they want to or not. You know, and I think the United States of America is going to change. I think Denmark is going to change. I think Thailand is going to change. So without any of these ideological preconceptions or commitments that belief entails, yes, I am willing to put my paddle down by the side of the canoe, and I'm willing to row. I'm willing to lend my strength to the struggle to move this boat in one way or another. But I do not believe in a fixed standard of good. And I don't even believe that what is good is knowable, you know? And out of this doubt comes a complex and I think useful political philosophy that we can apply in different cases on the scale of a society of millions of people living together, on the scale of a small town that may be 5,000 or 10,000 people living together. And this also has implications for how we live with our own husbands and wives, boyfriends and girlfriends, with our own small circle of friends and colleagues, living with that kind of doubt. Now, I'd say also, this has come up before about an hour ago, I think it's interesting that culturally we perceive a character who has no doubts as strong, but I think that is misperceiving weakness as strength. Someone who clings to an axiom or a principle, who clings to a fixed notion or fixed set of values. I'm saying that the real strength is actually that ability to adapt and doubt and innovate and experiment and deal with the consequences. Now, it's an extreme example, but it's, I think, a useful one briefly. Let's go back in time just to the year 2016. What was the best thing for Americans to do for the future of Afghanistan in 2016? What would be good for the American army, for the American government? I'll tell you one thing. You need a lot. Going back just that short time, just going back to 2016, right? You need a lot of really radical, fundamental openness to regretting the decisions you made in the past, to looking back at the decisions you made starting in September 11th, 2001. We go all the way back to the 1970s. A U.S. policy in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, they're all linked. U.S. policy in Central Asia. You know, okay, you can go back a long way. You can go back to the 1970s and start regretting the decisions you made. That could lead to a brilliant new plan, a brilliant new strategy for what to do in Afghanistan, Central Asia, Pakistan. Pakistan matters a lot, you know, okay? Or you can live your life as a kind of moral absolutist. You can live your life based on belief. And for many people, that is how they live. You can live with a refusal to regret the decisions that were made as recently as 2001, a refusal to look back and regret the decisions that were made in 1971. Afghanistan involves decisions in the 70s. A refusal to regret the decisions that were made 6 months earlier, right? Well, if I had been involved in American military planning and American political strategy for Afghanistan, Central Asia, Pakistan, India, China, for that part of the world, you can imagine I would have been the guy in the room saying, hey, let's really go and question our presuppositions here, guys. And even at the level of a thought experiment, to be willing to sit there and hypothetically think out, well, look, guys, up to this point, up to the year 2016, we've been totally dependent on Pakistan as our strategic ally. Fuck Pakistan. What if we make Pakistan into our enemies? Let's think through a bold new strategy where we're fighting against Pakistan instead of fighting with them. Now, hashtag spoilers. If you'd done that in 2016, everything would be different in the world. If you'd done that in 2011, everything would be different. So I'm choosing an example. But my point is not the real world outcomes of that. My point here is to highlight the willingness to reflect, the willingness to analyze, the willingness to question, the willingness to doubt. And that's all predicated upon a kind of unbelief, a kind of rejection of belief, a refusal to believe in things. And, the idea of U.S. foreign policy being good, it's very different from the fixed notion of good in the Catholic Church or in the Muslim faith, the transcendental good, that the distinction between what's good and evil is fixed forever by some ancient sacred text. But in practice, they're not that different. In practice, there is a hush and a sense of awe in the boardroom meeting. There is a sacredness and there is a taboo that governs what questions can be asked and what questions will go unasked, what is thinkable and what is unthinkable. Okay, so another great. I'm sorry, this obviously live stream can't go on forever, but I'm happy to have these challenges. So, longtime viewer of the channel, do you want to give me the kiss? Asks, quote, is the provision of pornography for free on the internet an improvement? Sorry, I said quote. I shouldn't have because I actually did paraphrase. But is it a good thing? Is it an improvement for the world to have pornography freely available on the internet? Okay. I am willing to begin researching that question with the profound assumption that I don't know. Now, Japan is in many ways a wonderful society. Denmark, in many ways, a wonderful society. Thailand, in many ways, a wonderful society. Is that in part because they have the freedom to produce and consume pornography? Or is it despite that? Like, is it actually a cancer eating away at Japanese society, Danish society, and Thai society, right? But I'm willing to really examine that, starting from the presupposition that I don't know. And now I think if you research it, you're going to start coming to broad or specific conclusions. If we are contrasting that to societies where pornography is really forbidden and really suppressed by the government, then we're looking at a place like Saudi Arabia, right? Now, I'm not suggesting you a simple cause and effect relationship there. And I think if you really are examining this, I was just reading an article this morning that was talking about actually the problem of child pornography in Japan. There are negative aspects to pornography in Japan. There are definitely negative aspects to the knock-on effects of pornography and sex work, prostitution, in terms of the attitudes men have towards women. I would say it also has negative attitudes. Has negative consequences for the attitudes that at least some women have towards men. I'm really willing to appreciate and analyze all of these things, right? This is very different from an argument that proceeds from belief to belief. And that's the way most of our ethical discourse goes. And that is really the kind of prison that a belief in moral realism leads you into. When you think that moral judgments and ethical decisions are like transcendentally right or wrong, that they're right or wrong at all times, in all places, for all people, in the same way as the laws of gravity, these geometrical theorems, and so on and so forth. That really leads you into this prison where you can't engage in that kind of questioning. Also in terms of your personal relationships with people, but in the scale of a society of millions, and on an intermediate scale as well, where you can't say, look, I don't know. You can't really do the research, and you also can't engage in experimentation and innovation. Now, I'm going to give you a more specific challenge back. This is from, do you want to give me a look at this? So everywhere in the world that I know of, basically the age at which people can start producing pornography now is 18. I don't know. I think there probably are a couple places in the world where instead it's 16. I'm not even going to Google it. But generally the legal age to produce pornography is now 18. Okay, tougher question. Would the world be a better place if it were illegal to film yourself or be filmed producing pornography until you were 21, 24, 26, 36? I know some people might say, you could, in theory, you could divide Japan into two halves. And half of Japan, it's illegal to film pornography or look at pornography where anyone is under the age of 30. And in the other half, it's 18 or 16 or whatever it is. Now, that's challenging, right? If you're over the age of 30 yourself, and some of you will just say, oh, come on, who has sex at all when they're over 30? I get it, but now that's challenging. Now, when we're not just talking about having pornography versus not having it, but we're talking about a very narrow sense of the age of consent, not the consent to have sex, but consent to produce pornography. Okay. And then the knock-on effects of that. Now, my fundamental point here is I do not begin or end that discourse by saying to you that I know the truth and that my conclusion about what's morally right and morally wrong is true for everyone at all times and always has been and always will be. And who can say that 18 is the right age? Who can say that? It's quite a recent thing that 18 emerged as the standard. Still in some parts of the world, you can get married at 14. Even within the United States, people are getting married at 14. Think about the implications of that. People are getting tattoos at different ages too. And there is a counter argument. If you keep letting people delay making decisions with these tremendously serious consequences. So people don't just go to high school, they go to university and they continue living in their parents' house and their parents are making these decisions for them. You have the problem of the infantilization, of the species, basically. So look, there are serious questions with really interesting implications, right? But I'm saying my way of approaching this really creates the possibility for reflecting on what you assumed in the past and regretting it. A large part of learning comes in the way of regret. It creates the possibility for research. It creates the possibility for innovation. And the belief-based discourse, or just the perception of the world in terms of fixed, real moral values, it prevents all of this. Melissa, if you want to jump in again, I'm just reading the comments here. Yeah, Pausimian says, fair point. Saudi Arabia has great dates. This is date as a noun, meaning Saudi Arabia, great dates, great coffee. So a lot of people don't know that. Some of the best coffee in the world still is produced in Saudi Arabia. It's not what they're famous for. Yeah, that's true. Hummus, no? You never hear about Saudi Arabian falafel hummus. Can the Saudis not get some credit for their cuisine? Vegan food in Saudi Arabia.
So earlier you were contrasting innovation with not progress, but there was another word that you used. This is, to me, gets at the imperfection of language generally. But do you think that by using the word progress that you inevitably have an ideal of what is the perfect, making progress toward perfection, or is it progress?
Right.
Yeah.
So Melissa is asking about the implications and innuendo of the word progress. So Arthur Schopenhauer has this great dictum that's somewhat underrated in its significance, which is we judge every time we use a verb. It is certainly true that in using the term progress, you are revealing the fact that you believe in a beginning, a middle, and an end, some destination you're moving with, that you've made a judgment that one thing is better than the other. With that having been said, of course, I'm not afraid of it, but you should really be mindful. Now, look, just today, I've heard a lot about progress toward the decriminalization of heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, hard drugs. Progress that includes the legalization of marijuana, progress that includes a larger and larger percentage of the population being on prescription antidepressants. So this is a great example. Well, what other people call progress, I do not call progress. So no, just in that way, you need to be mindful of it. But I mean, for the most part, you just encounter that as a cynical ploy of people to try to get you to agree with their political views without really mentating it, without really thinking it through.
Sure, but something like improving the system of waste management here in Victoria, for example, it would be a sign of progress if the waste was being directed to a water treatment facility rather than being dumped into the water.
Right.
And in these real world, in not just discussions of ideology and philosophy, I think I'm even more comfortable saying that would be progress to be using water treatment.
Right, but it's not so different from saying it's better. I mean, that's all. I mean, the word progress isn't any more or real.
Progressing as a society.
No, but this video is about ethical judgments. Obviously, in a case as my conclusion is not that you shouldn't make ethical judgments, but you've got to be aware that you're making an ethical judgment. So no, obviously you can make an ethical judgment that sewage treatment is better than dumping untreated sewage into the ocean. It's a very unsurprising ethical judgment. But, I mean, many people are flabbergasted when they find that there are human beings who refuse to drink water with fluoride in it. There are people who refuse to use toothpaste and so on. And they didn't realize, this isn't just something that's real and absolute. No, this is a moral argument you have to make. So that's all. Let's just really understand.
Sorry, I just say I think of that in the same sense that I think of veganism. I think that is generally comparable to the waste management. Becoming a more vegan society, I think, is progress.
Right. But that is just an ethical decision in your head. That's the tragedy of it. Yeah. And, if even if nobody disagrees with you, so even if, and this may be the case, even if there is nobody in our society who will stand up and say that they think your argument about sewage treatment is bullshit. Nobody will say that. But for decades here, for at least 50 years, that was what because they just refused to build a sewage treatment plant here. And by the way, if you guys can imagine, there were complaints in the newspapers, and there were actually a lot of complaints from the government in Seattle, in America. There were international complaints because they have to deal with the same water. And they're like, look, we spend all this money doing sewage treatment, and you guys don't, and we get your pollution washing up on our beaches. Well, even if nobody stood up and made a kind of ethical or moral argument that that's not progress or that's not good or is not necessary, in reality, implicitly, they did live accordingly. So no, the point is, by switching from switching from explicitly ethical language to a more technocratic language, talking about progress, you don't escape the relativism and the aestheticism of your moral judgments. That's all that comes down to. That this is your idea of what's good or what's better or what's an improvement. Now, you can get out in the world and you can make it convincing for others. I compare it to singing a song. There was a guy named 50 Cent. He was a rapper, and he had his story to tell, and he had his song to sing. And it was a song that included rage and revenge and violence and hatred and resentment towards his own mother and resentment towards the man who murdered his mother and resentment towards his ex-wife and memories of his own criminal past and his time in jail, Okay, and it was also a song of hope and desire and greed, wanting to be rich. He made his song matter to the whole world, but it's not good, and it's not progress, and it's not necessary, and there's nothing universal about it. And when I was living in Thailand and Laos, it was quite funny for me to talk to people who didn't get it. At that time, 50 Cent was really still famous. And it was it was ongoing chart-topping hits. He had hit songs and how's coming out. And there were people in Laos, I remember particularly. I don't remember talking about this in Cambodia. They're like, look, what do you people like about him? They would also say things like, he's ugly. Why do you like him so much? Well, we don't care that he's, whether or not you think he's ugly. Plenty of women think he's beautiful or he's handsome, but regardless, why does this guy, he's ugly, he's a criminal, he's stupid, he doesn't say anything intelligent, his rhymes aren't particularly erudite or what have you. I remember people also complaining that he rhymed too slowly. He didn't rap in a very fast or skillful way like other rappers. Well, no, there's nothing objectively real, but he sang his song and he made it matter. Now, some political leader, some demagogue could sing a song anywhere in the world that convinces people for a time that it really is morally compulsory for them to be vegan, that it's morally compulsory for them to brush their teeth, that it's morally compulsory for them to really care much more about pollution going into the water or the air than they do. And I say for a time, for a reason. Tragically, it's very unlikely to last. It's very unlikely to last as long as the Muslim faith, which is so many centuries under its belt and is still going. But this is the sense in which that term moral aestheticism is, I think, so terrifying. If you take ethics, morality, and politics, and you're willing to admit the extent to which these things are, just like the fine arts, it's terrifying. Nobody wants to think that. Nobody wants to think this is just like the question of who's going to be the next hit rapper, the next fad, the next fashion, that there isn't a sense of definite direction and progress, that there isn't a universal or transcendental or real sense, morally real sense, transcendentally real sense, in the way that gravity is going to continue to be true regardless of what we think about it, that it's instead going to be in the realm, as Shakespeare says, of, there's neither good nor evil, but thinking makes it so. Now, I just like to point out, in terms of regret, some of you, let's say you have a friend who was a rapper at the same time 50 Cent was a rapper. You might look back and regret and say, my friend was a better rapper. His lyrics were more meaningful. His story was more worthy of being heard. But your friend wasn't a successful rapper. There is no objectively real sense in which you can say your friend should have been more successful than 50 Cent. Like, you have to realize this sort of reckless, terrifying arbitrariness, not randomness, but arbitrariness with which one man's words take on power, political power, religious power, symbolic power, and ethical power, emotional power. Somebody has a song to sing, and people decide, for whatever combination of reasons, that they're willing to hear it. Now, we can analyze that. I mean, we can analyze, why did everyone hate Hillary Clinton so much in that one crucial year? It's for real reasons, not for no reason. And why did they decide to give Donald Trump a chance? Even if the reasons are bad, we can weigh into that. But it's a very different type of regret when you're looking at history in this way, and you're able to regret everything endlessly without the island of certainty provided to you by moral realism, by the sense that there is a real and true answer to each of these questions, even if nobody but yourself seems to know it or agree to it. Sorry, I'm just catching up with your written comments, guys. So many different things I could answer here. Generally, many of these questions, I could say, read my book. A lot of this stuff is discussed in the book, and I'm not boasting to say it's discussed not in a way that's just autobiographical. It's not just meaningful to me, but it is discussed in a way that can be applied directly to the questions of how do we organize the criminal justice system in our time, the legal system, how do we write constitutions, how do we write laws, what is democracy in our time, what was it in the ancient past, what should it be in the future. So these questions are talked about at length and with depth, with practical applications. And so I do think they're talked about in a way where it's going to be meaningful for your life, whoever you are as a reader, not just the meaning that nihilism has for myself. There's one interesting question here. Someone called T-Man, or perhaps Taman, says, quote, there are indigenous cultures that seem to reject Western ontological and epistemological true-false distinctions, yet are obviously not moral nihilists, coming from an anthropological perspective. Yes, but my claim, my argument in favor of historical nihilism is not on the basis that there ever has been any culture in the history of the world that has been nihilistic. Quite the contrary. I mean, we all should admit that nihilism on the level of a society or even of a church or a town has never existed. It has always existed for extraordinary individuals. Individuals can become nihilists or can become nihilists to some extent. You just have to stop believing in things, and you have to start to critique and reject the reasons behind belief and so on and so forth. I don't need to get into the definition of nihilism in this video, and I've certainly made other videos talking about it. But anyway, I wonder. There's nothing wrong with you raising that fact. I would also just point out it's certainly something discussed in the book. Again, in a way that's, I think, useful and applicable to people's lives. Nihilism is not incompatible with coercion. Nihilism is not anarchism, nor does it take a positive view of anarchy. For example, the fact that you are a nihilist does not mean that you're opposed to the government compelling people to brush their teeth. Compulsion of innumerable kinds exists in every society. I mean, again, anthropologically and otherwise. It exists also in every modern organized urban society. However, to stick with that one example, I remember reading very serious arguments written by specialists in that field as to why, for scientific reasons, the government of Laos, a third world country, should not introduce fluoride into the drinking water. And these people were not hippies. They were scientists in exactly that field, and they were really saying that the scientific reasons for why fluoride was introduced in Western countries in the past, those have now been debunked, that with the progress of science, now we should not be fluoridating tap water, drinking water, and so on. And when I read that report, I'd never thought about that before. It just had never crossed my mind to question and criticize the assumptions. And you can imagine it's one of those things like, well, back in the 1950s, we assumed this, this, and this, but then there was more research in the 80s, and now we know this. Again, that is certainly an example where I have not come to a conclusion. But it's an example where even in these things that seem self-evident, seem to be self-evidently good, or something seems to self-evidently be progress. And at that time, Laos, as a third world country, they did think of progress as being catching up with countries like Japan, countries like the United States of America, and just imitating the technology they have and imitating the form of social organization they have. Well, think again. That's the role for doubt and examination and regret and innovation that comes from a more nihilistic perspective. Perfectly reasonable question. Someone asked, where am I selling my book? I assume I'm just going to put it in English on Amazon. That's going to be direct purchase from Amazon. It's possible I will speak to a publisher who convinces me to do otherwise. But my feeling about that has changed over time. I mean, the book is so subversive. It's so anti-establishment. I mean, it's really dissident literature. It's the sense of being a political dissident. Sometimes I read certain parts of the book and I think, why would I even talk to a publisher? No publisher can carry this. It's so contrary to the norm in our time. And I should just accept it being a direct purchase from Amazon only. But sure, there were other times, frankly, when I'm reading other parts of the book, because I'm doing final proofreading here, where I feel the opposite, that I think, wouldn't it be great to have a relatively mainstream publisher, or even just a small political dissident publisher, carry this book and promote it, so on and so forth. So no, I do. I have mixed and changing feelings with that, but I think the short answer is Amazon.com. The title of the book is indeed No More Manifestos. Okay, there is plenty of humor in the book. I have a question about that from Pausemian. It does. Sorry, if you read the book as a whole, there's some parts of the book where I think I've accomplished something great in having the most humorous and lighthearted approach imaginable to describing police brutality and actual police massacres. So it deals with some very, very tough episodes from recent American political history. Maybe the most lighthearted and entertaining critique of the history of the American Constitution you've ever read. Also, there is humor. And there's humor where I'm mocking myself, and there's humor where I'm talking about my own family background. I do have jokes about my relationship with my now deceased father and so on. There's a personal touch to it, and there's a humorous touch to it. But with that having been said, it's a tremendously serious subject matter. And that's why I also say I kind of despair of the possibility of a publisher taking it on, because it is so serious. And if you're not already familiar with my school of thought, which most of my readers will be from YouTube, like you just imagine someone sitting down with this who doesn't have any familiarity with me, I can imagine just how disturbing it would be. Okay, so look, guys, I've got also some questions about Max Stirner. Indeed, as other people have said, there have been many YouTube videos with Max Stirner. Some of you guys might remember this, some of you might not. But years ago, I say this in closing the video. This is my wrap-up comment, by the way. There was another YouTube channel, and they identified as anarchist. And I had a kind of conflict with this YouTube channel. They attacked me and denounced me. And I remember writing to the guy, and he did reply. I said, look, why are you being so mean to me? I've actually been quite respectful and cordial to you while analyzing and disagreeing with your views, because I'm not an anarchist. But anyway, the guy, he had been a doctrinaire anarchist. He was someone who believed in the doctrine of anarchism. He had been a dogmatic anarchist. And then he had a turning point in his life when he read Max Stirner. Now, Max Stirner really isn't a nihilist, but I think some of the questions that lead to nihilism do get asked by Max Stirner, can lead people on the path to making some of these breakthroughs in their philosophy and their critique of politics. Anyway, so he had this kind of unbelievably emotionally overwhelming breakdown where he realized that for him, anarchism, which had started as a critique of religion, had just become his religion. Anarchism, which had started as a critique of social conformism, had instead become for him a suffocating political ideology that entailed its own kind of conformism. And remember, one of his ways of putting it was, he realizes now that politics is not ultimately about being right. It's not ultimately about believing the right things. That politics and philosophy really are about your own lived experience. On some level, I sympathize with the guy. This was a real breakthrough for him. He had been an anarchist. He read Max Stirner, and he ended up rejecting anarchism for the same reasons that he had formerly rejected communism and conservatism and most mainstream political thought in order to embrace anarchism. But now he realizes anarchism itself is the problem, and he has to take a further step towards nihilism, or at least towards skepticism. At that time, he started describing himself as an egoist. I think he didn't say a nihilistic egoist, but maybe something like this. Started using the term egoist, and he started a period of real reflection. But yes, the point of philosophy, the point of politics, and the point of political philosophy is not to have, a sort of checklist of all the things that you're right about, all the things that make you morally superior to other people. That's the point of Catholicism. Like many forms of Christianity. So did you get baptized? Did you go through confirmation? Did you take your vows? Did you attend the right ceremonies? Do you believe all the right things? Have you read the whole list of doctrines? Can you memorize and recite certain passages of the Bible? Oh, yeah, you're going through the checklist. Oh, these are all the things that guarantee you. Now you can feel certain that you're right. Now you can feel certain that you're morally superior to other people and intellectually superior to other people also. This is what your spirituality consists of, is a checklist. And, your identity becomes the checklist, and your checklist becomes the identity. And at some point, you don't know who you are, but you know what's right and what's wrong. You know what's morally good and what's morally evil. And in your commitment to that knowledge and you're clinging to that false sense of certainty, that becomes your identity. And you are, before and above and beyond everything else, you are a good Catholic, whether or not you're a good man. It's laughable to me, but obviously on some level I can sympathize with that guy's struggle. Philosophy ultimately is about problem solving. It's a set of problem solving tools. So how is it that so often the problem solving method itself becomes the problem? How is it that so often the critique of political institutions becomes a suffocating and oppressive political institution? How is it that the rejection of one political ideology so often produces another that may be as bad or worse? Or, as I said before, in a very different context, it may be better in the short term. The new ideology may be better than the old ideology just for the next 5 years. When you think about it over 50 years or over 500 years, it starts to become suffocating. Starts to have these disadvantages that may not be apparent in just a single stage of analysis when all you're thinking about is abolishing the old ideology that you want to get rid of. And of course, a terrifying example of that is to look at what happened in the French Revolution and the dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte that ensued afterward. And to really ask yourself, what decisions would you have made at each step of that revolution? And what would you have regretted looking back on those decisions just 5 years later, or what have you? Knowing what I know now, what should I have done at that earlier stage of the revolution? And look, sorry, just to put a human face on it again very briefly, I've been reading a book. It's actually here on camera. This book contains some really gory details about the American Revolution that I didn't know before. It describes, in the American Revolution, basically the Civil War between the United States and England at that time, call it a revolution. It describes atrocities. It describes revolutionary violence. It describes people being tortured. And some of those atrocities, some of them are carried out for cynical reasons that come up again and again in revolutions, like you're interrogating and imprisoning people because they happen to be wealthy, and you want to, the revolutionaries want to steal their wealth to use it for the revolution. So, knowing what I know about that history and looking out, it's very difficult to think about what decisions I would have made at different stages of that revolution and what I would have ended up regretting, because those are decisions you make that have, once you've made the commitment, once you've said the word, that may be all it is, you don't get to change your mind. Now that's the side you're on, and you get to see all the unexpected consequences of the revolution that you're a part of the war that you're fighting. So this is very true of the French Revolution. It's very true of the American Revolution. And, it's very, very hard for people to look back and say, these were my reasons for fighting this war. These were my reasons for joining the revolution. But these were the unexpected outcomes. And that wasn't what I was fighting for. So this comes back again to this leitmotif throughout this video of the capacity for human regret. And there's a sense in which you can feel responsible for the decision you made, but you can't feel responsible for the outcomes. Some people would have chosen to support the revolution for all the right reasons, but then would be horrified by the outcomes. Some people would have chosen to oppose the revolution for all the right reasons, fight for king and country, but then be horrified by the outcomes of that and realize where where that went, and so on for every side of the French Revolution at every stage. What terrifies me about the year 2021, 2020, 2021, 2022, this little span of 3 years, what terrifies me is that nobody perceives themselves in this way to be in the midst of a revolution. And we are. We're living through a period of the revolutionary transformation of our own societies, of the planet as a whole. Not even Saudi Arabia can stay the same. Not even communist China can stay the same. Not even conservative but democratic Japan, not Denmark, not Switzerland, not the United States of America. The societies we live in 50 years from now are going to be far more different from what they are today than they are today, being contrasted to what they were 50 years ago. We are in the midst of a period of transformative social change. And one of the reasons why the revolution is going so badly is that so few of us are willing to reckon with the kind of regret that's entailed when we perceive ourselves as the revolutionaries that we really are.